The discovery. Winter descended upon the Swiss Alps with its customary silence, transforming the village of Verbier into a postcard of pristine isolation. Here, among the chalets owned by billionaires and titans of industry, stood a property that had become synonymous with scandal. The holiday villa of Prince Andrew, Duke of York. For years, this £13 million refuge had served as the Duke's escape from the relentless scrutiny of British tabloids and the whispered conversations in palace corridors. But in February of 2023, what began as a routine property inspection would unravel secrets that reached far beyond the snow-covered peaks. The discovery came not from investigators or journalists, but from an unexpected quarter. Marie-Claire Dubois, a local property manager hired to oversee maintenance during the Duke's extended absence, noticed something peculiar during what should have been a standard walkthrough. The villa had remained empty for 18 months, an unusual duration, even by the standards of the ultra-wealthy. Prince Andrew, by then largely withdrawn from public life following the catastrophic Newsite interview and the subsequent settlement with Virginia Giuffre, had not returned to his alpine sanctuary. The property stood silent, accumulating dust and questions in equal measure. Dubois entered through the service entrance on that February morning, her breath forming clouds in the unheated interior. The villa sprawled across 6 floors, each room more opulent than the last. Persian rugs stretched across marble floors. Chandeliers imported from Venetian glass makers hung dormant in the dining room. Paintings, some bearing signatures that made Dubois pause and reach for her phone, lined the walls and gilt frames. But it was not the obvious displays of wealth that caught her attention. It was the locked door on the 3rd floor, set back in a corridor she had never been asked to clean. Property managers develop instincts about spaces. They learn to read the architecture of secrets. This door, unremarkable in its construction, bore a lock far more sophisticated than those securing rooms filled with crystalline art. Dubois had her instructions. Inspect, document, report. But the door presented a problem. It appeared on no floor plan she had been given. According to the official blueprints filed with the local authorities, this section of the 3rd floor should not exist. She contacted the property's legal representatives in London, a firm whose letterhead featured an address in Mayfair and whose partners counted several members of the aristocracy among their clients. The conversation, she would later recall, felt oddly scripted. She was told to leave the door alone, that it contained personal items of no consequence, family heirlooms, and private correspondence. But legal firms do not typically grow nervous about heirlooms. Their anxiety carries a different frequency. One Dubois recognized from her years managing properties for people who had much to hide. What happened next remains disputed. Some accounts suggest Dubois contacted Swiss authorities out of concern about insurance liabilities. Others whisper of financial incentives, a tabloid payment that could transform a property manager into a comfortable retiree. The truth likely occupies the murky territory between duty and opportunity. Regardless of motivation, within 72 hours, representatives from the local police arrived at the villa, accompanied by lawyers and a locksmith who specialized in high-security mechanisms. The door opened to reveal a room that should not have existed. Approximately 20 square meters, windowless, climate-controlled to museum specifications. The air that emerged carried the scent of leather and paper of documents carefully preserved. What they found inside would send tremors through Buckingham Palace and raise questions that the royal family had desperately hoped were buried forever. The room contained filing cabinets, 7 in total, each meticulously organized. Inside were documents spanning 3 decades. Financial records detailing transactions that wound through offshore accounts in jurisdictions famous for their opacity. Correspondence between the Duke and individuals whose names appeared regularly in investigations into international arms deals and questionable business practices. Photographs, some innocent, others deeply compromising, arranged in albums with dates and locations noted in careful script, and perhaps most damaging, documents that appeared to be insurance, records kept not for memory but for protection. Among the files sat evidence of the Duke's relationship with Jeffrey Epstein that went far beyond what had been publicly acknowledged. Flight logs that did not match official statements. Records of payments made through intermediaries. Communications that revealed a friendship built not just on social convenience, but on mutual benefit of a kind that made even seasoned investigators uncomfortable. The Duke had always maintained that his relationship with the convicted sex offender was a mistake of judgment, nothing more. These documents suggested a narrative far more complex and considerably darker. But the Epstein materials, explosive as they were, represented only part of the discovery. The cabinets also contained evidence of the Duke's business dealings, the web of relationships he had cultivated over decades as Britain's special representative for trade and investment. Names of dictators and oligarchs appeared alongside records of payments and favors exchanged. The line between royal duty and personal enrichment had blurred into non-existence. Here was documentation of a parallel life. One lived in the shadows of diplomatic privilege where a prince could broker deals that would land ordinary citizens in prison. The Swiss authorities, acutely aware of the diplomatic implications, moved with careful deliberation. Photographs were taken, documents were catalogued, and then in a decision that would later face intense scrutiny, they contacted the British Embassy in Bern. What happened in the hours that followed remains partially sealed behind diplomatic protocols and national security classifications, but the outlines are clear enough. The royal family had been presented with a crisis that threatened not just one member, but the institution itself. The palace response. News of the discovery reached Buckingham Palace through encrypted channels, delivered first to the private secretary and then, with careful phrasing, to King Charles himself. The king, barely 6 months into his reign following the death of Queen Elizabeth II, faced a dilemma his mother had spent her final years quietly managing. Prince Andrew had been a problem for decades. His behavior a constant source of anxiety for palace officials who spent their careers managing scandals. But this was different. This was evidence meticulously preserved of activities that could not be explained away with vague statements about errors in judgment. The meeting convened in one of the palace's private offices, away from the statums where tourists wandered and photographers gathered. Present were the king, his private secretary, the master of the household and legal counsel whose expertise lay in the intersection of constitutional law and crisis management. Also present via secure video link was Sir Edward Llewellyn, a former diplomat whose experience negotiating sensitive international situations made him invaluable in moments like these. Charles, according to sources familiar with the meeting, listened in silence as the situation was outlined. His brother had kept insurance files. The implication was clear and deeply personal. Andrew had not just engaged in questionable behavior. He had documented it, creating an insurance policy against the day when the family might move to distance themselves permanently. It was a betrayal that cut deeper than tabloid scandals or embarrassing interviews. It suggested a man who trusted no one, not even his own blood. The legal assessment was blunt. If these documents became public, the damage would be catastrophic. Criminal investigations would likely follow, not just in Britain, but in multiple jurisdictions. The Duke faced potential prosecution. But beyond Andrew's personal liability, the files threatened to expose decades of royal tolerance for behavior that should have triggered intervention years earlier. The palace had known or should have known about aspects of the Duke's life that were now documented in meticulous detail. Their failure to act would be scrutinized mercilessly. The discussion turned to options, each worse than the last. They could claim diplomatic immunity, but that would spark outrage and potentially a constitutional crisis. They could cooperate fully with any investigation. But that meant exposing the monarchy to accusations that would dominate news cycles for years. Or they could attempt to contain the situation through negotiation and, if necessary, pressure applied through channels that exist in the gray areas of international relations. King Charles made a decision that would define the early months of his reign. There would be no cover-up, he declared, but neither would there be unnecessary exposure. The palace would cooperate with legitimate legal inquiries while protecting information that was genuinely sensitive from a national security perspective. It was a middle path that satisfied no one, but perhaps prevented the worst outcomes. More significantly, the king made clear that his brother's time as a working royal was finished permanently. There would be no rehabilitation, no gradual return to public duties. Prince Andrew was in effect excommunicated from the only life he had ever known. But the king's decision addressed only the official response. Privately, the royal family was fracturing. Prince William, already wary of his uncle's influence and protective of the monarchy's reputation, argued for complete transparency. Let the truth emerge, he insisted, and deal with the consequences. Better a painful reckoning now than years of drip-feed revelations. Princess Anne, the king's sister, took a harder line. She had never hidden her contempt for Andrew's behavior and saw this as confirmation of everything she had long believed. Her position was stark. Remove him from the family entirely, strip him of titles and allowances, and let him face justice without the shield of royal protection. The queen consort, Camilla, observed these family discussions with the careful neutrality of someone who had learned painful lessons about public perception. She understood that the monarchy's survival depended not on protecting its members, but on demonstrating that no one stood above accountability. Yet she also recognized the human dimension. This was her husband's brother, a relationship complicated by childhood memories and family bonds that did not vanish simply because of scandal. Prince Andrew himself remained in Royal Lodge, the 30-room mansion in Windsor Great Park that he had fought so hard to retain. When informed of the discovery, his reaction oscillated between defiance and panic. He insisted that the documents were being misinterpreted, that context was being ignored. But his arguments convinced no one. The files were too detailed, too carefully maintained to be dismissed as innocent record-keeping. They represented a man who knew exactly what he was doing and had prepared for the day when it would all come to light. The conversations between Charles and Andrew during this period, conducted away from staff and recording devices, would remain private. But those who saw the brothers in the aftermath described a relationship shattered beyond repair. Charles had spent years defending Andrew, absorbing criticism from advisors who believed the Duke should have been removed from royal duties decades earlier. Now the evidence of his brother's duplicity sat in a locked room in Switzerland, a monument to misplaced loyalty. The palace's official statement when it finally emerged was a masterpiece of controlled language. It acknowledged that certain materials had been discovered during a routine property inspection.